death is a real thing, you know, and it's this awful erasure of all of the glory that we think that we're building up, and it's erased in a moment, you know.
Like, why do we do philosophy? Because we're wrestling with our finitude, right? Like, not to be
Yeah.
Heideggerian, but we're beings toward death. This is why Socrates, one of the first arguments that's made in the Phaedo is that philosophy is a purification of the soul from the body, so that we can conceptually remember the difference between being an embodied thing and being a psychic or a soul thing. And that is, we have to wrestle with that question.
There is a certain kind of nocturnal dream in which we dream with one part of ourselves, and yet at the same time, we know with another part that we are dreaming. The dream continues and is a real dream. That is, it's not just a waking reverie. And yet we know that we are dreaming. We are there outside the dream as well as being there within it. I think we may let ourselves be instructed by such dreams in the nature of true vision. Poets have sometimes been called visionaries and sometimes dreamers, but they are likely to be poor poets unless it's this kind of dream that we are connoting when we use the word. Poetic imagination is very close to the dreaming of such dreams and has little to do with reverie. In reverie, we lose ourselves, we are absorbed, but in imagination, we find ourselves in finding vision.
All right, so welcome back to another episode. We're gonna start today, I hope, where we left off last time, which is discussing the role of the imagination when it comes to philosophy, poetry, returning back to this idea of the value of divine madness, as well as maybe touching on some of the tensions that exist within Platonic philosophy and the poetic world, right? So trying to get in to the nitty gritty of how it is that we can reconcile the age old war of muthos versus logos. So, yeah, just want to open it up to return. We ended, I believe, thinking about the nature of imagination. Gareth, would you like to say something about that with regards to Blake?
Yeah, I can come straight in on that actually, because it's interesting that you mention this idea of a kind of conflict between muthos and logos. Um, because I think one argument could say that for Blake, they are the same thing. Um, I mean, in fact, in a literal sense, because he, in his mythology and imagery, in let's say in a vision of the Last Judgment from 1810, he in fact identifies Christ, the Logos, as the imagination. So uh, the figure of Jesus is this kind of uh, symbol for the kind of unification of vision, imagination, and a kind of eternal, stable world of archetypal forms in a sense. And of course, Blake, in his description of those things, is unconventional, if you like, and uh, uh, it's not, uh, you know, doctrinally Christian as such. Um, and it's mixed, as many of his other writings are, with a whole range of other symbols and Platonic allusions as well, of course. Um, and we mentioned we were talking about the passage in the Ion, and we were talking about the kind of inspired madness idea, enthusiasm, and so on. Of course, Blake is rich in those kinds of images, um, and in a way, what you see unfolding in some of his work is this tension, which I guess is born of the time between the kind of rationalism, the sort of Newtonian conception of the universe, and a kind of mechanical conception of man and so on, alongside a uh, you know ecstatic sort of description of images of the imagination. And it's really interesting because Blake, I think, um, views the imagination uh, in a very particular way. The world of imagination is the world of eternity. So imagination he sets apart from mere allegory. And in this sense, one can maybe tease out some of the tensions at play in his reading or apparent opposition to the passages we discussed in the Ion, because Blake wants to say that I suppose this is a kind of real vision. And interestingly enough, in the passage after it, so, I'll just reread it quickly. He says, Plato has made Socrates say that poets and prophets do not know or understand what they write. This is a most pernicious falsehood. But then he goes on after that to describe for him what is really the truth of vision, what he calls stupendous visions. But it's really fascinating because I think this gets us to some of the interesting territory we've covered all across the conversations we've had about how each of us has a certain view on the divine, but how perhaps the relative nature of that view doesn't diminish the truth of the vision, so that we have different kinds of ways of looking at it. And we can come to it in different ways, whether that's through writing, music, poetry, philosophy, as it's understood in the modern academy, and so on. And Blake,
Yeah.
back,
I'm so sorry.
Blake backs that up because he says, I have represented it as I saw it. To different people, it appears differently, as everything else does. For though on earth things seem permanent, they are less permanent than a shadow, as we all know too well. And then he goes on to describe why, you know, imagination and vision is so important and so on. I'll leave it there. I can come back to it. But I just think it's a really fascinating idea because, on the one hand, he's making a kind of truth claim, but on the other, he's supporting that with this idea that we each of us see it in a way that's attuned to our own nature,
Yeah.
if you like.
We each have a different lens, right? So it doesn't mean that we're not looking at the same thing. It's just the vantage point, so to speak, requires I describe it in one way and you're going to describe it in another way. I mean, this is how I think, people can communicate regardless of, speaking the same language, right? There's a sense in which the language is the tool that gets us to be able to talk about love, or to be able to communicate to the person across from us that we love them. But maybe one person will give their beloved a poem while the other person will walk them out of Athens and have a wonderful meandering conversation about the nature of love philosophically, so on and so forth. Yeah, no, for me too, I think about the importance of imagination because Plato had such an amazing imagination, right? Like to imagine the Callipolis and that world and all the various different places of where the virtues go and the descriptions of philosophy and the sail what oh I'm forgetting the name of the boat. Oh my goodness. The ship of state, there you go. Sorry, I knew she would come. The ship of state, or the myth of or the eschatological myth in the Phaedo, right? The visions that he could invoke in his own ability to write. And that just is so beautifully at odds with the tension of Socrates in the Republic, saying that we have to get rid of the poets. How do each of you guys, I mean, I see Blake wrestling with it, but how do you guys, as Platonists, reconcile the ejection of the poets in the Republic, or
I
how
was
Republic
glancing,
is?
I was glancing at some of my notes that I took on Emerson's essay, The Poet, and he talks about true poets versus false. And he said that the false poets expressed, as he calls it, the ground tone of conventional life, whereas the true poets are more visionaries for Emerson. And those visionary poets, which I think Blake would be that type of poet, um, invite us to understand something about our depths, something about our essential human condition in a way that the conventional poet just reflects back some of the conventional stuff that we get attached to, whereas the true poet calls us to something deeper. And I think that Plato, I don't know Plato's critique of the poets well enough to really address it, but certainly Emerson felt that the ground tone of conventional life poem and poets weren't really worth our attention,
Mm.
whereas he's more interested in poets as what he calls them liberating gods. They wake us up to what we've forgotten, and they're not necessarily following the rules of conventional life because it's sometimes almost required that you break those rules in order to penetrate to that deeper quality. So it led me to a question that I had when you were talking, Gareth, and that is, is culture itself rooted in a poetic vision, and that great poets create a kind of vision of who we are and where we are, and then we develop conventional ways of implementing that vision, and we get attached to the conventional habits and the conventional associations we have about that, and we move away from the visionary dimension of it. But ultimately, the worlds that we live in are rooted in some sort of visionary kind of experience. And I think that even our own today, our culture is rooted in certain kinds of visionary experiences or dreams or hopes that people try to make reality. And it's a question of, are we still, people talk about, are we living according to what the founders actually thought? People use that kind of language, and then we argue about what does that mean. But there's something in people even raising that motif that suggests that um, the culture that we're in is invented by, and I don't mean that in a trivial way, but it's invented by the imagination of great visionaries like
Mm.
Blake or Plato or um, any other great poet. Like, I mean, Milton created a fantastic sort of vision of how to understand our place in the world and the powers that are in us, and we need that. And without it, we're just, as Emerson puts it, hooked into the ground tone of conventional life, which is what we get in um, television and online. A lot of online media stuff is just pushing around conventional stuff. I'm just talking off the top of my head now, but that was my immediate reaction to some of the things you raised, Gareth, and you asked, Danny.
So you're both touching on something that I think was a central question for Plato. I think about the sophist and the arguments at the end of the sophist, where the dialectic stranger is trying to distinguish how it's possible that the sophist can lie, right? Or that lies or falsehoods. What is a falsehood, right? So when we make this distinction between the true and the false poet, I think we're doing something similar to what the dialectic stranger was doing in the sophist. How can we, like, what is the criterion? Is it just we know it when we see it, right? Is it just the criterion that they wake us up and make us remember the more than the mundane, right? So that most of us get stuck in the drudgery, as you're saying, of the 9 to 5, go home, get the groceries, make the dinner, watch your Netflix, hopefully fall asleep, and never really break that pattern. And that's what good poetry can do, is the waking up. Is that the intuition that knows how to recognize this? Or are there ways to pinpoint, as the stranger is doing in that text, the criterion for how it is that we can say that something is not the real kind? Yeah, just want to put that out there.
So what does he come up with as his strategy to find the solution?
Well, basically, it's a spin on the Parmenidean question, right? Like you either have the way of what is or the way of what is not, and you can't go down the path of what is not, and then you've got the mortal path of the way of what is and the way of what is not. But they don't really realize that they're just walking down the way of what is, right? And so it's the importance of this kind of relative being, right? So that the falsehood is not nothingness. It's not absolutely empty of content, but it's, relative. It's content that kind of knows that it's not the thing itself, but is pretending as if it is. And so that would be something I think is along the same lines of poetry, right? That it kind of is aware of its own lack of being, you know, the absolute truth, but it pretends as if it is. And so maybe that would be a good criterion.
Maybe I find your answer a little bit confusing,
Mhm.
but that's okay because a lot of that is confusing. It's not that the way you were saying it was not clear. You were real clear, but I think even if I listen to it and hear it clearly, I still find it confusing because I'm trying to discern how one is able to evaluate uh, true poetry. Then, can poetry ever be true in this way of looking at things?
And that's the question, right? Like, because we all know, right, that the poet, we're using the imagination. So where is the truth value in poetry, right? And then the double question is, well, if we find the truth value in poetry, even though we all know it's a kind of lie, and that's part of what I think the Dialectic Stranger is getting at, is that, we were talking about vantage points, right? That we're each seeing it differently. How is it that we're all knowingly kind of missing the mark or lying, but we're still getting at the truth with our attempts to explain it, because we really are, like the demiurge, looking to an invisible paradigm that's kind of drawing us to say what we want to say. And so somehow we can say, that person is speaking truth, even though it's actually not, the words coming out of my mouth are not actually true, right? They're not actually a one-to-one representation of that thing I'm looking at, because that thing I'm looking at has no facade, it has no image or discursivity, and we're trying to give it, versus the poet who's, or the sophist, who's simply looking to puff up their own reputations, their own identities, and we can kind of somehow realize that they're not looking to anything bigger than themselves to write or to be inspired. And yeah, is that a criterion? And is it one that we can, because that's the point, is that both of them, both the true and the false poet, are lying in some such way. And so,
Okay, no, that helps me. But maybe Gareth had some thought because
I was
we
thinking of
haven't.
quite a few things. I mean, there's another remark by Emerson somewhere where he says something on the lines of, when we hear a great line of poetry or something, we almost remember that we came up with it ourselves or something like this. So there's this
Yeah,
recognition.
that's from Self-Reliance. It's almost the first
Yeah,
line. Yeah, it
yes.
comes
So
back with sort of a glory that we recognize as our own, but we've
exactly.
forgotten it.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, right, right.
Yeah, that we've forgotten. Yeah, exactly. And so here's tentatively, there's this idea, I suppose, that what imagination is, or maybe what the truth of poetry is it's not about some kind of um transactional image, one that I can say, here's an image, you have it. It's me creating the space for you to find the image or something like this. It's the
That's
kind
no,
of,
that's nice. That's a nice way to put
yeah,
it. It's creating a space for you to discover your own way of engaging the depth.
yeah,
And the poet draws from her own depth and creates images, but it's not the images that you find with it, but it's the way that they've been communicated that somehow wake you up to your own longing and your own need for connecting with your depth. And
mm,
then your own images will come up so that we're all coming up from different ways of engaging it. So it's not so much that we need to memorize the poem, although the poem is a kind of sort of a touchstone to remind us of this experience, but it's the experience, it's the activity that we are awakened to. That's the important thing. And at least that's what I hear you saying by the poet creates the space in us to
and
wake up.
and both of you have used the word recollection, right? Which I think really helped me in this moment to think about, it's not just an intuitive gut punch where I know it when I see it, right? When I read a good poem, I'm like, yeah, this is a good one. No, it's much like how I explain, the Meno and the problem of recollection, where I will walk through doubling the square with students, right? And I say, look, you guys are following this. Your light bulb is going off. It's tracking, so to speak. So that recollection, or the theory of recollection, is that all this knowledge is within us, so that everybody can learn to double the square because of simple steps of remembering basic things like line, point, figure, so on and so forth. And maybe that's what the poet does, is it does it not through reason, or at least not through reason that is, analytic or mathematical. Maybe there's a different form of recollection caused by imagery and or words that are liminal, that also have a kind of tracking button, a light bulb button. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Um, Say that last piece again, though, because I was with you, and then at the very last part of the phrase, I started to think about something and
No, it
wasn't
happens to
paying
me
as
all the
good
time.
attention.
So,
But
so when I was just teaching the Mino last week, and so I was
yeah.
walking them through how to double a square, right?
Hmm.
And I would say, hey, do we do it by making the line go up or to the side? And students say yes or no, and I'm like, look, you're the one telling me that's right or that's wrong,
Right,
right?
right. Yeah.
And I'm not teaching you that this makes sense, right? I'm teaching you how to double square, but I'm not teaching you that it makes sense, that you can follow this, and that you have the ability via reason. And reason is kind of going into the warehouse of your soul and doing the math, right? Checking the math and saying yes, yes, yes. And so, in some sense, poetry has a different mathematics, if you will, that
Okay.
allows us to say that made sense. Even though those words were Dadaist, somehow it made my light bulb go off to where it tracks, right? I can say I've recollected something, right? I brought it from within, in the same way that learning how to do mathematics within the Platonic Academy would have also been described as a process of recollection.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
the thing about words in that way is that you could, I mean, I don't know if this is really a good way of putting it, but if we said, 2 plus 3 is 5 and 3 plus 2 is 5, or if I said, consider the sublime truth, or if I said, consider the truth sublime, you know, something in the arrangement of the words, or even just the cadence of the delivery, creates that space, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Saying sublime truth and truth sublime, one has a space and the other one doesn't.
I like the second one better as far as that goes. Truth sublime. It kind of opens me up more than sublime truth.
Well, yeah, yeah, indeed, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, can we take this? The sophist talks about the lies and the truth, and I think somewhere, I'm not sure where, but I think in Iamblichus, one of his commentaries, that the sophist is compared to a sorcerer, and the difference between goetia, sorcery, and theurgy is that I think sorcery has a kind of, you were describing what the sophist does. I'm giving this argument or this presentation to enhance my own power, to enhance my place in the world. And it's not about transformation, but collapsing energy or drawing it into myself to empower me. And that I associate that with a kind of sorcery. Um, and poets, because poetry is so capable of opening us up the way you were describing, Gareth, um, I would think that any one of us who's capable of writing a poem that's evocative or writing an essay that's evocative, um, can very much be drawn into the um, the sorcery part of it too, of thinking, how cool is this? Let me have this published and people will cite my piece. And what a cool thing that is. I'm the man. And then it's sort of like, what's the effing point? It's been lost. And probably better just to do these things and not ever keep track. Like you don't look at the videos after we've done them. You just move on because you just have to trust that what happened happened. But It's almost as if the academic discipline is geared towards this kind of wrong-headedness of trying to create your curriculum vitae and all of the accomplishments you've done and all of that, which is counterproductive to the transformation of the soul. It's almost like building up a storehouse for your I don't know what we want to call it.
Well, this actually touches on a question that I was thinking about this morning. I read an article about the death of literacy, that we're entering into a new oral period of communication. And the author wanted to argue that with the emergence of mass printing production, we get, the kind of revolutionary overthrow of what is predominantly an oral culture, which tends to be more mystical, more poetic, more
Yep,
inclined to believe propaganda, more inclined to, get into the mass hysteria kind of thing. And so that, and then basically argued near the end that Plato, this is why Plato turned to writing, was to bring to punch back against this oral culture that was too mystical. And of course, I was like, no, he learned to write in such a way that retained that mystical, that, other. But when we're talking about the magic of these words, right, we were talking about the sorcery, we're talking about, because I immediately think that the move to a written culture is at the service of the person who cares about their reputation, cares about their name going down in history, wants to be remembered for that book or for that idea. And so that, written culture reinforces this kind of graveyard of reputations. Does that make sense?
yep, yep. It does. I mean, that's what I was getting at with this.
Mm.
It's almost as if the academic discipline, by definition, is goes against the transformative mystagogy that I would think is should be part of the Platonic tradition. And yet, whenever you start to write things down and preserve what's been written, it's almost impossible not to fall into the trap of that graveyard mentality. Um, I guess just to remember death is one of the one of the things that kind of ensures that we can't get too attached because death is a real thing, you know, and it's this awful erasure of all of the glory that we think that we're building up, and it's erased in a moment, you know. Um, and I wonder what maybe you can help us on this, Danny, because I know that you're really immersed in some of the complexities of Plato's dialogues. Does he really engage that in the way that I mean, I know that there's in the Phaedo that Socrates, but tell us what he says or who
Oh, I
says it.
think it's one of my, I think if I were going to say that there is one thing that constitutes being a Platonic initiate, so to speak, is to have that faith in the immortality of the soul. And the arguments that are advanced in the Phaedo, I think, are quite beautiful. But most people concentrate on the arguments for the immortality of the soul versus the eschatological myth and the insistence on a certain paideia, right, in education, that he says, because Crito is like, oh, what should I do for your sons? And Socrates is like, give them this education, give them this possibility to entertain and think about the immortality of the soul, the absolute nature of it, because that's actually what is transformative, is realizing that the dead do not die, right? That the dead are with us as daimons, guiding us every single day. So that Socrates is insistent. I'm not going anywhere, guys. I'm gonna be in the true world, in the real world, that has so many more colors and all these things. And if you guys have listened to my paideia that I've been offering you, or that we have been building, then you know that whenever you hear that word saying, don't do that, that is Socrates guiding you. And then if he's a good guide, then maybe he'll become a god. I mean, this is, again, I think we touched on this last time. This is why I think the Neoplatonists had this kind of hierarchy, so that the memory of all of these ancestors, they could ascend, so to speak, right? You're a hero, Hercules, then, by the end of a certain period, now you're a god, you're in the stars, you're part of the whole of it, because you keep staying alive within our spirit, and guiding us to do great things. And so I mean, there's a lot, I can get into the nitty gritty, but I also think this is why Socrates utilizes myth, is the staying power of myth to remind us of the people who told us those stories, right? The poets, or the mythologist, or the theurgist, who could invoke that. And yeah, and so that's why poetry somehow does that, is it reminds us of the living voice behind the poem.
I mean, I was thinking this circles us back to some of Greg's opening thoughts about what it is to participate in a collective image, or a collective vision, in a sense. And I suppose
Mhm.
part of what we've been talking about for a number of weeks now is something like this. Because in a sense we're here moving about in a certain kind of world of images, which has this eternal recurrence of sorts. Uh, and there's this eros to grasp it, to keep finding it. And it's precisely what Blake is touching on again, this very idea. Um, and he uses this really wonderful image. He says, yet the oak, and it's quite Platonic as well, yet the oak dies as well as the lettuce, but its eternal image and individuality never dies, but renews by its seed. Just so, the imaginative image returns by the seed of contemplative thought. The writings of the prophets illustrate these conceptions of the visionary fancy by their various sublime and divine images as seen in the worlds of vision. So there's this idea that there's this seed, this renewal, and that in a sense, the engagement with this tradition in all its varieties is the cultivation and renewal of images which can again be seen, can again be found, can again be discovered. And in this sense, I mean, this positions it very interestingly against the sense in which perhaps what you were alluding to, Greg, is our sense of how we become enamored with a certain egotistic idea of what matters in terms of images and our how we appear to others, or all of these kinds of things, and whether that's through what we write or make. Uh, but what we find in these sorts of conceptions of the recurrent image is some kind of true meaning, some sort of meaningfulness of sorts.
There's a part of me that it has a voice in me, so I'll give it expression. It's almost heretical to everything that we're doing, but um, when Socrates says, you think that I'm going to die, well, how should we bury your body? He says, well, if you think you can catch it because, I'm not there anymore because I'm the soul, and 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 he's so clear about that. And it makes me feel good about, there's another world, it's a greater world, it's a greater reality. But am I just bullshitting myself? Am I just telling myself this story so I'll feel better about the awful termination to my life, my physical life? And are these wonderful writers all just coming up with these complicated, extrapolated sort of fantasies in order to avoid the grim reality that is and I know that sounds really depressing to even say that, but it's sort of suggesting that this whole tradition is rooted in a kind of a fear of death. Who was it? A guy named Becker wrote, the fear of death is like the basis of all religion and all philosophy, and that people are sort of unaware of it, and it's sort of a elaborate form of self-deception. And I ask myself sometimes, is this just some kind of self-deception? And maybe those are not my better moments, but that does come up occasionally for me. Um, so
Gareth, I
there's
could
that.
run on with the response to this, so I want to give you
Go,
room.
no, go for it. Yeah, no, go for
Oh
it.
no, I don't want that much room with that thought because it's not my most pleasant thought.
But I think that's one of the thoughts that actually gets people into philosophy, right? Because it's true. One of the like why do we do philosophy? Because we're wrestling with our finitude, right? Like, not to be
Yeah.
Heideggerian, but we're beings toward death. This is why Socrates, one of the first arguments that's made in the Phaedo is that philosophy is a purification of the soul from the body, so that we can conceptually remember the difference between being an embodied thing and being a psychic or a soul thing, and that is, we have to wrestle with that question. And I love the Platonic answer, because the Platonic answer is the answer of going back to the Parmenides, the poem, either being or not being, right? And, you know, every day we act as if not being. But we never experience not being. Not an area of time. None of us have. I think I've done this joke before, but when a kid asks you to spell nothing and you say Not, and they're like, no, you're spelling something. Like we only experience the something, right? And we have no ability, like not way, shape, or form. And so why do we think it's more rational that death is nothingness, even though we've never had an iota of that experience? And then second off, like this, like death, right? Just like the idea of nothing, like we can choose to either comport ourselves and live in such a way that we're going towards nothingness, or we can comport ourselves and say, look, on the divided line, after the imagination faculty, we have pistis, and that the whole of the Phaedo, Socrates repeats over and over again, it's a charm or an elpis, it's a hope, it's a great hope. We have to begin that real philosophy with its grain of salt begins with pistis, begins with this faith in the good, in the faith of absolute being, in the faith of the immortal soul. And then we have to jump in to that and then see the system that can be had when we believe, we say yes to being, we say yes to the good, and keep comporting ourselves that way. Or we could be like Hume and then just end up in this constant, if I don't have faith in reality, that reality is real and has some consistency, then yes, I'm going to advance a world where causal phenomenon aren't necessarily connected, because everything is just experience and observation. No, you have to believe first that there is something like cause and effect. And then once you do that, you have to build a system around it, discover the system around it. Okay, so
So
that's,
I hear what you're saying, and I get what you're saying. And then I think, is that really different from some devout evangelical Christian saying, the Lord Jesus is going to take me to heaven, and that's my faith, and I know that's, or somebody who's in Tibetan Buddhism saying, I'm going to be, reborn into a better life, or I'm going to go to this Buddha realm or that Buddha realm because I've done this prayer. In other words, how is the Platonic system, and maybe it's not, really distinctive from some of the other sort of so-called faith traditions that we're familiar with like the evangelical Christian, perhaps? I mean, the Tibetan Buddhist probably has a little bit more complicated way of talking about it, but and I don't want to sound like Debbie Downer here, like, but there's this gets down to the nitty gritty of what's moving this tradition, it
and
seems like.
I would argue that what's different from a faith dogmatic tradition is that
Hmm.
what the faith entails, my dog wants my inside, the faith entails is a commitment to the life of inquiry into philosophy, into the working these things out, and recognizing the value that it's not the so-called way I articulate the belief, right? That it's going to be, the argument from opposites or from recollection or from a myth, but rather it's the very activity of teaching and learning and turning around and thinking things differently. Like, to put it in the Christian context, the highest expression of faith, as I believe Kierkegaard once said, is to doubt. And being
Well,
a
right. And
doubting
so,
Thomas is the faith. Like, the only way you can relate to the divine is not by being like that God that knows it all, omnipotent. No, but to look, and as it was in the Euthyphro, to what the gods are looking at, and to know that as a human being, I'm a being of both knowing and not knowing. So I'm gonna have to constantly ask questions.
so my instinct to question the whole thing is really a move towards catharsis to make sure that I'm not attached to simplistic sort of formulas of security.
Yeah.
Which I can get attached to. It's easy to just sort of like, oh yeah, this is how it works, and then I don't have to really engage the difficult process of how I came to that, which is through a kind of, you know, facing the unknown.
And
Eh,
and think of Socrates, right? Like, in the Phaedo, he doubts even his own interpretation of a dream he had been having his entire life, of the muses saying, make music,
Right,
and work at it. And he had thought his entire life that that meant the highest music is philosophy. But hey, I'm gonna take the time to write some Aesopian poetry just in case.
right, 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 right. No, he questioned his own sort of habit,
Mhm.
and that's essentially what you're saying is necessary to do. Um, hmm. So back to what you were talking about, Gareth, that I think that you were riffing off the question I raised about that is every culture in a sense rooted in some vision of a poet or some poetic vision, and I think about, say, the culture right now in the West and the agonies that our culture is going through, and it seems somehow to me that we don't know what the poetic vision is, or people are struggling to find it. And they come up with, I think, simplistic answers, which is scary to some people. Like somebody will say, oh, well, now that, the answer is Christian nationalism. That's going to bring everybody together. That's the vision. And that just freaks a lot of people out. What does that mean? And I don't want some sort of formula like that, but I don't know that we've really. I think we need to rediscover what is the vision that underlies Western culture. And we used to have it, and it was in the Greeks, and it was still alive in the Renaissance. They still felt as if that they were still in those waters, so to speak, and could feel the quality of that in their lives. But we pulled ourselves so far out of that world that we're a little bit adrift. And I know that David Feidler writes articles about trying to recover, our Hellenic roots, or our, deep philosophic roots. But we do need to recover it. And I think that's what we're trying to do here, Danny, with this whole enterprise. Um, and I kind of feel like I'm failing to really come up with the vision for us, because I'm just aware that we're lacking um, in our culture right now a deep
It-
poetic vision. Go ahead, Gareth. Yeah.
well, I think maybe does that set up the bar too high for our aims in the sense that what we,
Yeah, of course it does. Yeah.
in insofar as maybe what we're doing ever so modestly is what we referred to earlier, which is rather than create the images, is trying to create a space for those images to be found in some sense.
Okay.
Uh, so, in a sense, following in the footsteps of the poets who have done that. And I wouldn't claim any great prophetic vision in how I do that, but it's well, I don't know. I've been on this kind of McLuhan thing for a while now. For some reason, I've been reading a lot of McLuhan, and principally because, in a sense, he was. as I may have mentioned before, he strikes me as a really interesting figure because he sits in a interesting space between uh a kind of Blakean uh poetic understanding of the relation to technology, but also he was a Christian, so he had particular and quite unusual, interesting views on the relationship between religion and technology and so on. Um, but when we were talking earlier about the nature of the transformation of oral cultures into written ones, and then perhaps back to oral or visual cultures in our contemporary sense. Yeah, I was thinking of McLuhan because his famous book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, this idea of the transformation of culture by technology, and there's this quotation here. He says, uh, "A goose quill put an end to talk, abolished mystery, gave us enclosed space and towns, brought roads and armies and bureaucracies." So this kind of sense of how the written word kind of transforms culture. Um, but interestingly, he says the handwriting is on the celluloid walls of Hollywood. The age of writing has passed. We must invent a new metaphor, restructure our thoughts and feelings. The new media are not bridges between man and nature, they are nature. So he has this kind of different conception of what it means to think through or imagine new communication technologies. Now, this is written, half a century ago, so it's not
Mm, mm,
written in the context of our, generative AI internet culture. But
mm.
it strikes me that maybe one
It's
of the tasks of the modern poet or the modern Blakean or the modern Platonist is precisely to engage those very mechanisms as the means through which to try to create those new visions and those new spaces rather than reactionarily, as it were. I think I agree with you on this idea of recovery, but also it's kind of about a way through rather than back. So how do you uh
Oh, right. We
yeah,
can't we can't recover an old vision,
Yeah.
but by becoming visionary, we are doing what they did then.
yeah, yeah, you
Yeah.
put it better than I yeah.
Because
No,
there's an
that's exactly
obstacle,
it.
right? And
Hmm?
so it becomes to invoke, Young and Homer's Odyssey, right? Like this is that part of that journey, right? Like is that you've got to have these monsters, and there's no pretending the monsters away. There's no pretending that AI and Apple phones and all of these things haven't, deadened our culture. But we have to remember that they're not going away. If we just bury our heads in the sand, if we become Luddites, all we're doing is giving ourselves our own private Idahos rather than actually participating in the community that we live in, right? And so that we've like that's always the kind of travail, I think, of each person who feels that they want to safeguard this education, that they have to figure out some way to be kind of sneaky, right? Matus like, right? To figure out how to use
Native. Yeah.
these things to return it back. I mean, that's again, I think a reoccurring theme that we've been talking about in this show is the heretical nature of each of a Blake, of a Plato, of any Iamblichus, so on and so forth. That they're trying to work with the culture that they're in and the things that that culture values, and to make those things do something different than just satisfy the gut and our base desires.
Well, right. It just occurred to me in light of what you just said that what Iamblichus did in his time was kind of heterodox in the sense that he's saying it's not by thinking, but by doing these performances, which is bound to push people in the culture he was in a different way. And did he do it because he was trying to reflect some of the rich traditions of the Syria that he grew up in? Maybe, probably. But I suppose that what we're wrestling with is how do we find some sort of magical way of communicating that enriches us in a way that's authentic instead of sort of a caricature of some previous idea. That's not easy.
We're looking for the new poet.
Well, that is exactly what Emerson says in his essay, The Poet. He says, no poet has yet to sing America, you know, and and he was looking for, actually was looking for a new poet. There was this guy named Mr. Jones Very, who turned out to be a completely psychotic dude
Mhm.
who spent some time in a mental institution in Massachusetts. And after they let him out, he went immediately and lived with Emerson for 5 days. Emerson was pretty broad in allowing a variety of different types of people in his world. Um, and the guy was nuts. The guy said he was the incarnation of the Holy Spirit, and he wanted to declare that to everybody. And there are people who become possessed by this archetypal sort of awareness, call it whatever you want, delusion, awareness, where they feel like that I am the Holy Spirit or I am the incarnation of this one or that one. And a lot of the things that they write and say are moving and powerful, and they're charismatic individuals. And yet at the same time, they can be completely effing crazy. And on what grounds do we call them crazy? You know, a lot of spiritual teachers in the world could be seen as those kind of people, and the communities that are around them could be seen as following a deluded madman or woman, and yet they find it makes their lives meaningful. Um, it's how have we avoided doing that? Well, I haven't actually. I've followed a couple of them in my time, but I didn't think that they were deluded at the time when I was following them. You know, that's simple as that.
No, for me, I mean, I always go back to that basic Platonic, like where live in such a way that you feel saturated with meaning, and that everything that you do has purpose and meaning. Uh, and I think it's more diluted to live in a world drained of meaning, drained of this kind of beauty and the good. And so, yes, I can look at the fact that mass amounts of people ignorant of their own ignorance will, you know, happily chew the cud and follow a guru around. Uh, but I don't think everybody's like that. I think many people, you know, actually have a kind of faith that gives them meaning, and
Oh,
it
I
doesn't
agree.
come.
I,
And
I wish I had that sometimes. You know, I've encountered people who are in traditions and it works for them,
Mhm.
and they seem to be living a very balanced life and very intellectually aware. And I think the key idea is that you're able to ask questions and to question the assumptions that you make, even about your own tradition that makes you feel grounded. And you have to be able to ask about that too.
And this is where we get the wisdom traditions within all of these schools, right? All of these different religious worlds. We forget, you know, that the basis part of following, you know, a let's say a hierophantic type, right, is the people who just blindly follow. Versus within all of these traditions, whether it be Platonic, Christian, Buddhist, you get the people who are doing the work, the scribal work, the questioning work, the philosophical work, and that's within. I mean, to go back to Gareth's analogy of the seed, that's the seed that always kind of hopefully gets passed in each generation. Otherwise, yeah, we're going to constantly be asking the same question that we asked of the poet and that we asked of the sophist: Who is the true hierophantic, right? Is it the same? You know, like, are they just deluding everybody? Are they the manipulator? Are they the magician? Or are they truly a theurgist who, yeah, isn't trying to manipulate anything? So,
Yeah, I like where this is going, and I've raised a reference to Kingsley before, but what essentially I enjoy about him is that he's willing to question Plato himself and say, you know, the whole tradition was based on a lie, you know, and then he pursues it that way. Um, you know, I admire somebody who's willing to go for it in that way, even if I don't agree with him. Um, it helps people to think for themselves, and not just take it as, oh, of course it's right, it's Plato, you know.
Gareth, would you like to have the last thoughts?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say it was a really enjoyable conversation. Maybe I could end with a quotation if you'd like me to, as
Sure.
has sometimes become customary. Um, but this was something that was coming back to something that Greg said earlier, and I thought of this, uh, and it touches on a number of the things we've talked about. It's about imagination, it's about poetry, it's about vision, and it's about this tension of whether we're inspired and if we lose ourselves in inspiration or if we find something. So this is a quote from Owen Barfield. There is a certain kind of nocturnal dream in which we dream with one part of ourselves, and yet at the same time we know with another part that we are dreaming. The dream continues and is a real dream. That is, it's not just a waking reverie. And yet we know that we are dreaming. We are there outside the dream as well as being there within it. I think we may let ourselves be instructed by such dreams in the nature of true vision. Poets have sometimes been called visionaries and sometimes dreamers, but they are likely to be poor poets unless it's this kind of dream that we are connoting when we use the word. Poetic imagination is very close to the dreaming of such dreams and has little to do with reverie. In reverie, we lose ourselves, we are absorbed, but in imagination, we find ourselves in finding vision. So I think it encapsulates this sense of the tension of discovery, of the role of the imagination, of being taken by inspiration, but also somehow losing ourselves to find something after all.
Yeah, the tension between discovery and creativity, right? Like,
Mm, exactly.
And then he's in it and not in it at the same time, which
Yeah.
is very interesting.
mhm.
Um,
Well,
So
thank you.
maybe we can pick up on that one next
yeah,
time.
no, that's a beautiful quotation.